Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. There was big controversy last weekend to see the amount of fines that is dished out to the drivers if they break a particular FIA rule, especially when Hamilton fined €50,000 for crossing the track at the Qatar Grand Prix. The FIA have now upped the potential maximum penalty from €250,000 to, rather inexplicably, €1,000,000 if the drivers do something wrong to quite that extent. The drivers understandably outraged by this, and a lot of them are saying that there's nowhere they're going to pay that money, especially if it's going towards the stewards having a nice dinner rather than actually towards a good cause. Very much enjoyed to your thoughts on this controversy in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. First of all, this is Sergio Perez's comment on his chance of remaining at Red Bull next season. Now I know people would say, well, he was asked the question, are you staying at Red Bull? Not, are you going to be driving a Formula 1 car for Red Bull in the primary team? And there is maybe a little bit of difference there. It's plausible that Perez stays on in the Red Bull family, but is not necessarily driving the car, if you see what I'm saying. Could be reserved, whatever you want to think, but still, I'm not sure that it's guaranteed, despite what Perez might say and what the team might say, that Perez is going to be in the car next year. I think that, at least in part, it depends on how these final few races go, and maybe a decision has already been made one way or another, and I think that especially just because Eric Van Haren, who is very close to Max Verstappen and his camp, and has a lot of intel on Red Bull, actually confirmed quite a few of the reports we've seen over the last few days with regard to the Red Bull situation. Now, we heard from the German press and the Italian press that there's friction at Red Bull between Horner and Marco and stuff like this, and to what extent that's true, that's on you guys to kind of decipher and decide, because as Horner said, well, people are only talking about this because we're winning everything and therefore the press get bored and they make things up. Now, are they making it up? I'm not so convinced, at least in its entirety, because Eric Van Haren, very close to Red Bull, says that internally it's known that Marco has his doubts about Ricciardo because he's still disappointed he left for Renault in 2018. Horner, though, is a big fan and would put Daniel in line if Checo were to be replaced. He then went on to say that Verstappen has indicated internally to the highest bosses, the Thai guy and Mintzlaff, that he is loyal to Marco and doesn't want anything to be changed, which definitely aligns with the report we heard the other day that Max had basically said, look, if Marco gets fired, I'm going to go as well. So, whether you believe that to be true or not, when Eric Van Haren is kind of at least ratifying part of the reports we saw the other day, makes you wonder whether there's even more of the things in those reports may also be accurate. So stay tuned for that one, but Red Bull will try and sweep this under the rug by dominating this weekend, I'm sure. Speaking of Red Bull, this is a better image than we had yesterday of Haas's new side pod, which is Red Bull inspired, although, maybe part of it looks kind of like Ferrari, Aston Martin, it's not a copy and paste of the Red Bull. And I will say, this is pretty funny, this red arrow here pointing to this little part that's sticking out, right? This is part of the crash impact structure, which they have homologated at the start of the year, so they can't move it. But the problem is now they're trying to put a new set of side pods on where they really want to be able to move this thing, but they can't. So it's kind of unfortunate of a Haas that they've designed their car, I imagine, in line with what Ferrari did, the crash impact structure, the homologation. Now they're trying to put their own Red Bull-esque side pods on, and it means that this part sticks out of the car, which is kind of going to ruin some of the airflow, I would imagine, in the undercut channel that they're trying to now create. So they're probably not going to get the full benefit of this intended concept switch, so I guess kind of unfortunate of a Haas, but we'll see if it works for them this weekend. There was also lots of images as to the new Mercedes floor. Now, let's be honest here, the likelihood is a lot of these images of the side of the floor, such as Albert Fabregas images here, okay, there's some noticeable changes, but you'd imagine that the most significant changes are probably to the underside of the floor. These are some alternate angles, the new version at the top, the older versions at the bottom, probably easier shown here. This is old on the top, actually, a new version here on the bottom, and you guys can see some differences in the side edge of the floor, but the reality is that the significant changes, if there are any, are probably on the underside of the floor that we can't see. Unless, of course, there is, some sort of incident this weekend with either Russell or Hamilton, and we do get to see the new underside of the floor. So this is the old version, the new version, etc., etc. Some minor changes and tweaks to the floor edge, but as I say, it's likely to be in the Venturi tunnels, where if there are significant changes, which apparently there are, they will be identifiable, but clearly not at the moment. Now, let's talk about this whole maximum driver fine drama, because this is kind of crazy. I don't know why the FIA have felt the need to do this. They have their justification, which I'm not really sure makes much sense. We'll see in a second. But the FIA want more money, and they've announced that the change to its international sporting code at the after a meeting of the World Motorsport Council or whatever, to increase the maximum driver fines in line with the modern day or something. This is what they say. The FIA said the change was necessary because the upper limit for fines had not been reviewed nor amended for at least the last 12 years and does not reflect the current needs of motorsport. So we know that Hamilton was fined 25,000 euros up front and then 50,000 euros total, I think, for crossing the track in Qatar. And they've also upped the other ones. Of course, they fined Red Bull 6 million for the cost cap thing, but that's not driver related. And they've also upped it for Formula E to 750,000 euros, and for other FIA championships up to 500,000 euros. So why exactly? Okay, sure, they say it doesn't reflect the current needs of the motorsports. It's already pretty rare that a driver gets fined anywhere near that number of 250,000 euros anyway. So why would they need to increase that maximum to 1 million unless they're intention is to start really ramping up these fines, right? We even saw it was a discussion last weekend after the Qatar Grand Prix when Hamilton crossed the track, and they then re-reviewed it and said, well, we might need to give a more severe penalty here because Hamilton's a role model and therefore he's affecting younger drivers' perceptions. And Hamilton said, that was kind of poorly communicated from their part. I'm not sure that's necessarily what they meant, but it's like, well, if the limit is 250,000 euros and you're dishing out 50,000 euro fines all the time, but you actually want to start dishing out 200,000 euro fines, that feels like, oh, you're pushing the upper limit. If you increase the limit to 1 million euros and start dishing out fines of 100, 200,000, all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's not too far off the limit. So it's definitely controversial. And the drivers, I mean, look, the drivers aren't going to be like, oh, fantastic, good job FIA, I'm really happy that you guys can find us more money now. And it's kind of funny that they just kind of get to decide what the penalties are, what the fines are, and what the limit is. Like, you know, what if they wanted to put the limit up to 100 million euros and started fining, you know, Hamilton's entire net worth? I imagine there's something in place there, but still, Verstappen, Hamilton, Leclerc, and others were kind of bemused by this, as race fans report. Leclerc basically said, that's a lot of money, and for a lot of the drivers, that exceeds what they're really making, which is where Alex Albon comes into the discussion in a second. Doesn't affect Hamilton so much, doesn't affect the likes of Verstappen so much, but of course you guys probably remember when Verstappen touched the rear wing of Hamilton's car in Brazil 2021, 50,000 euro fine. But this is the thing, right? What could they even do that's worth €1 million fine? I mean, over the last couple of years, there have been a few fines, but there hasn't been anything crazy unless their intention is that, oh, okay, we quadruped the cap, so let's start quadrupling all the other fines as well, so that 50k all of a sudden becomes 200k. I don't know. But yeah, Verstappen was just wondering, what would I have to do to get fined €1 million if typically I'm getting fined 50,000 for doing something pretty bad? Maybe then we can sponsor the bottles of wine, I'll get ready. And this is the point that the drivers were getting across, is like, well, we don't want to give this money away for nothing. Are we just lining the checkbooks of these guys and the FIA? Like, surely this money, if we're having to give it to them, should go to something of a good cause. Russell, as the head of the Drivers Association or whatever, says that it's ridiculous that the maximum fine is increasing, especially because of the amount of money that some of the lower drivers are making. And this is the issue that we discussed the other day, that they seems to be discussing the fact that Hamilton was getting treated differently. They talked about, oh, he's a role model and therefore his fine should be worse or his punishment should be worse. That really shouldn't be the case. If any driver walks across the track, there should be a fine that is associated with that. And we talked about the fact that Verstappen and Perez and even Sargent had done that in recent couple of years. They weren't even investigated nor fined, but Hamilton was. Why the difference? That's a matter for debate. But still, if you walk across the track and that's a 50,000 euro fine, that should apply to everyone, Logan Sargent or anybody. The problem is that for some of these drivers, let's say they start upping those numbers considerably, they simply can't afford it, actually. And even Russell says in his first year of Formula 1, obviously in the Williams days, he was on a 5-figure salary. So he wasn't even getting paid 100,000 quid. Apparently he was on a 5-figure salary and actually lost over 6 figures in that first year, paying for my trainer, paying for flights, paying for an assistant. And that's probably the case for 25% of the grid. So, this is the thing. You need money to get into Formula 1. And even if you're really good and actually in Formula 1, doesn't guarantee you're making, boatloads of cash straight away because you're, driving for a lower tier team. You've not got crazy sponsors coming in yet. You might be doing all right, but you've got to pay for all these things, and you've kind of got to get through that phase to then you can get to Mercedes and start making the big bucks, which is kind of what eventually happened with Russell. But it's a good point. He says that, probably 5 drivers on the grid are making a loss year on year. Now you want to find them an extra €1 million. Like, where's that coming from? We're doing what we love, so we're not complaining about that. But if you take a year one driver who probably at the end of the year is losing over €100,000, let's just put it in euros, because of the investments he has to make, you find them $1 million, what's going to happen then? So, I think understandably, and even the likes of Kevin Magnussen, right, who, he's probably not balling out on Haas. I don't imagine they're paying anything obscene. The contracts aren't public. We know that Verstappen and Hamilton are probably making like 35, 40, 50 million a year. But, for the drivers further down, it's a different story. Magnussen said, that sounds ridiculous. Charles can give his watch, right? Because he's got the Richard Mille and, the sponsorship there. And those watches are, at least they used to be worth several hundred thousands of dollars. And, maybe some of them still are. But, watch prices, if you guys are aware of what's going on in that market at the moment. But whatever. Charles got some expensive watches. He could give them away. But I will just disappear, never to be found again. So Magnussen's like, yeah, I am paying that, boy. Don't matter what you're fighting me for. No way am I sticking around for that. And Hamilton, of course, who would have the money to spend on this, doesn't want, and I get it, the money just to go to the, to the wine collection of the steward. Because there's got to be a bit of a conflict of interest in there, has there not? If the stewards can be like, what if we find this guy a little bit more money? Then that money comes to us, and eventually it kind of gets back to my pocket in some roundabout way or another. So, it's a bit of a conflict of interest involved. Now, I'm sure they'll say it's not, and the money goes to this pot to do this, but I don't know if I fully believe that. And as Hamilton says, if they're going to fine $1 million, let's make sure that 100% of that goes to a good cause, or, just any old cause, I guess, something better than the steward's pockets. There's a lot of money in this whole industry, and there's a lot more that we need to do in terms of creating better accessibility, better diversity, so that's the only way they'll get that money from me, which is, I think a pretty good statement from Hamilton. He's like, look, I'm paying you guys money to, pay for your caviar or whatever. Like, it's going to go to some sort of good cause. And then, okay, sure, you want to fine me some amount, then fine, I'll do my philanthropy work through the means of the FIA. Even Alex Albon commented on this as well and said that, yeah, probably 3 or 4 drivers, we're talking, Verstappen, Hamilton, Leclerc, and, some of the other big ones that actually are on the big bucks. Alonso as well is probably on some big money as well, could afford this amount of fines. But, Albon is not necessarily convinced that this is a good idea. So, of course, the drivers are going to oppose it, but I just don't really see why it's necessary, especially when fines don't really get given out up to 250k. The only thing I can think is that they're quadrupling the cap so they can start to bring the fines up so it doesn't look so unreasonable. But yeah, definitely intrigued to your thoughts on that in the comments section below. Just to close out the video, there was some more controversy actually involving the Mercedes boys on the events in Qatar. And, over the last few days, there's been lots of discussion from, let's say, Martin Brundle and other ex-drivers saying, look, this is an extreme sport. The drivers are expected to compete in these extreme conditions, and that's absolutely fine. Now, I'm kind of on the borderline, but because I see both sides of the argument here, and definitely even drivers such as Alonso and such as Hamilton that were around in, let's say, the late 2000s, racing in Malaysia and, Singapore with the refueling stops, they were pushing flat out all race. And I don't think the Qatar next year will be anywhere near as bad. They probably, you would think, won't have to do the mandatory stops, which means that they're not pushing quali lap after quali lap for 57 laps. They are, they're managing their pace somewhat more. And it's also slightly later in the year, should be a bit cooler. So, I don't think it'll be as bad next year. I don't think it'll be a massive concern. But I definitely see the part of things that, Stroll and others were saying, look, I was basically passing out during that race, which is a big danger to himself and to other drivers. Hamilton and maybe others would say, look, just train harder, right? Just be fitter and be more ready for those situations. And to be fair to Alonso, given the fact that he's 42 odd, he seemed to be one of the drivers in better shape at the end of the race. Now, Hamilton says, all right, I didn't do the race, so maybe, I didn't get to feel the pain that the other drivers felt, but Malaysia was much hotter than that race, and I know what it's like to lose 4 to 5 kilos in a race and barely being able to stand afterwards. And it was a discussion, over a decade ago when these races were happening, and they were like, do we need to shorten the races and stuff like this? But the drivers, and I think the drivers are always going to err on the side of pushing to race in any condition, right? They want to race, they'll do basically whatever it takes to do so. They want it to be on that level of being an extreme sport. And, you know, at some point, you've got to kind of, maybe, if the circumstances apply, protect the drivers from themselves in the same way that Esteban Ocon said, like, I'd literally have to die before you make me stop a race, which is probably not the best thing to say, but it gets the point across as to the way these drivers think. And as Hamilton says, my feeling towards it is, this is an extreme sport. You don't have marathon runners who are passing out after the marathon saying you've got to make it shorter. This is an extreme sport and we are paid very highly for what we do. From my perspective, when I've not been feeling great at the end of the race, I've just got to train harder, and that's how it's been for me. Back in the Senna days, you go over the curb, the grass, you pay the penalty. It's like, let's not get too soft. So that's Hamilton's point of view, controversial to say the very least. Some drivers think differently, some fans think differently, but you know, from a racer's perspective, I definitely get where Hamilton's coming from here. What I think is interesting is that Russell, given the fact that they're teammates, actually has a very different view and responded to some of the comments from Brundle and others who were saying that, oh, just get on with it, guys. He was like, look, they're commenting from a different era. They were driving cars that were 20 seconds a lap slower than we are. Or he actually said the quote the other way around, but the point remains the same, that, you know, they were dealing with, when they were having, you know, hot, tricky conditions, it was difficult to us because we're dealing with more G-forces, etc., etc. But, you know, Hamilton did drive in eras with maximum, you know, big downforce cars, like especially even the early 2010s. Like, those cars were really good and, like, I think underrated in terms of how much downforce and G-force they did produce. But Hamilton is kind of on board with some of the OGs on this one. So definitely controversial. But yeah, earlier video than usual today, just because this is the start times for this weekend's qualifying, which of course goes on today because today is quali, tomorrow is the sprint race, Sunday is the Grand Prix itself. So I thought I'd just do an earlier video. I might do another one this evening to recap qualifying, depending on how much chaos happens, or I'll just go again tomorrow sometime. But anyway, thanks for watching as always. Take care of yourselves, leave your thoughts down below, and I'll see you next time.